Good afternoon. Good afternoon and welcome to the National Teach-In on the Presidential Executive Order banning Muslims, immigrants, and refugees. My name is Mariam Kashani. I'm an assistant professor of Gender and Women's Studies and Asian American Studies at the University of Illinois in Urbana-Champaign. I will be moderating the discussion today. In organizing this teach-in today with the sponsorship of the Center for the Study of Race and Equity in Education at UPenn, we felt compelled to respond to the recent executive order that specifically targets Syrian and other refugees and the citizens of Muslim-majority countries, Iran, Iraq, Libya, Sudan, Syria, Somalia, and Yemen. In marking the significance of this political moment, we feel that in order to understand what is happening and why, we must contextualize it within social, political, and legal histories. We hope that we can begin some of this work with you today. We have over 100 classrooms participating today from across the nation, as well as over 1,000 more individuals and groups, so that is really exciting. We are joined by an excellent group of activists, academics, and lawyers, also calling in from the East Coast, Midwest, and the South. They will each make a short presentation. This will be followed by a 30 to 45-minute question and answer period. We encourage you to participate by using the chat window on your YouTube link to message us your questions and comments. We also encourage you to participate on Twitter with the hashtag TeachinEO2017. And we would also love to see photos of your community or classroom viewings. We will begin with a description of what the order is and what it does, and how specific communities have been affected and are responding to it. Khalid Beydoun is an associate professor of law at the University of Detroit Mercy School of Law and senior affiliated faculty at the UC Berkeley Islamophobia Project. Khalid? You're muted.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. So, sorry, apologize for that. So the executive order was passed on January 27th. So it's been roughly about 2 weeks now, a little less than 2 weeks time, where President Trump obviously looked to kind of, enshrine much of the Islamophobia we heard during the campaign. He passed this order, which obviously is being called rather widely a Muslim ban. It had impact on specifically designated 7 countries, all Muslim majority countries: Iran, Iraq, Libya, Somalia, Sudan, Syria, and Yemen. It initially impacted both immigrants and non-immigrants, which means that, initially speaking, visa holders, so individuals who are here coming temporarily to study, to work, to visit, individuals from those countries were included, and also green card holders. However, since then, green card holders have been removed from the order. It's important to understand that the order, when it was the order was very poorly written, very ambiguously written, which is why it initially first included green card holders, which was unprecedented at the time. It also put a temporary halt on all refugees coming in, and explicitly named Syrian refugees to be restricted from entry for a longer period of time. So obviously this order had an immediate impact. Individuals from the 7 countries and refugees who were trying to come back into the country, making plans to return to the United States, were directly impacted. They were obviously detained at airports, couldn't come in. We saw a lot of the protests across the country. In direct response to the detainment, you had incidents actually where individuals couldn't even board planes in their departure countries. So a lot of chaos, a lot of mayhem on the front end when this order was initially passed into law. Since then, there's been a lot of, obviously there's been a lot of litigation. There's been a series of court rulings, federal court rulings in response to the order. Initially, we had 2 orders come out of Virginia first, and then the federal court out of New York. The most momentous one, obviously, has been the one to come out of Seattle a couple of days ago, which was just argued in the Ninth Circuit yesterday, the appeals court on the West Coast. And the case was argued on the merits, which means that in addition to this temporary restraining order that the Washington court was able to kind of exact a couple of days ago, the Ninth Circuit also heard many of the constitutional claims in relation to the order, which obviously are very meritorious. You have strong First Amendment claims with regard to religion, free exercise of religion, the strongest, in my opinion, being the Establishment Clause claim. Generally speaking, Establishment Clause just means that the state cannot entangle religion, cannot specifically or explicitly name Islam as the religion and the people to be excluded by way of immigration. That would be a violation of core Establishment Clause principles. Also, broader equal protection claims made against the ban in line with the 5th and 14th Amendments. So that is kind of the lay of the land, legally speaking. Obviously, there's a lot of flux. It's still a very fluid situation with regard to the law. Before I end my talk, I want to speak about some of the activist-related work we've been doing across the country, primarily in Detroit. So one thing we focused on and kind of aligning with the spirit of this teaching is to go into the community, go into the masajid, the mosques, go into the schools, community centers, and have direct, education-oriented workshops, because there's a lot of confusion, a lot of misinformation circulating in the media about what the Muslim ban actually entails. And I'm from Dearborn, Detroit area, which obviously has a concentrated Yemeni, Syrian, and a huge Iraqi community, which is largely working class and recent immigrants. So this work has been really important because many of these communities are the ones that are directly impacted, obviously, and there's a high incidence of misinformation and confusion around what the ban actually is. So shifted from my legal work and more kind of, I guess, my scholar activist work in the last couple of days. I'll leave it with that, and I'm happy to answer any questions with regard to the law and where it might be heading, and also some direct action work in impacted communities.
Okay, thank you, Khalid. So now we go to Nisreen Alamin, an anthropology PhD student at Stanford University. Her research focuses on community resistance to land dispossessions in Central Sudan. She was detained at JFK Airport and later released upon her return from Sudan last Friday.
Hi, I don't know if...
Oh, there you go.
Is that working? Okay.
We hear you. We don't see you, but...
Okay. Okay. So I just want to say thank you. Can everybody see me now? Is this working?
No.
Well, I'll start speaking, I guess. So I just want to say thank you for inviting me to be part of this conversation. As Mariam mentioned, I was one of over 100 people who were detained under this executive order as I was coming back from Sudan actually about 11 days ago, where I was doing dissertation research. Many more were not allowed to board planes despite having visas that in some cases took up to 2 years to get. I was released, but many others were deported back to where they had boarded their planes when the order first was signed, and some were separated from their families in the process. One of the things that really struck me during my detention was how the outcomes of our detentions, especially as green card holders, were quite arbitrary. In my case, it was up to the officer in charge and dependent on a criminal background check whether or not I'd be released. And so the language of the order is in some parts quite vague, which then leaves much up for interpretation by individual officers who have their own biases and prejudices. In terms of the criminal background check being a determining factor, as a Black person living in America, I know, for instance, that resisting unlawful arrests can be classified as a criminal offense. So in my head, I was thinking this could go badly for so many people I know and care about. It's important to emphasize that there are 3 African countries on the list: Somalia, Libya, and Sudan. And so we also have to think about anti-Blackness violence against Black bodies, police brutality, and racial profiling in this country, and how that will play into how this order is going to be enforced by individual officers. So as a small example, the fact that I was handcuffed, the fact that a Somali mother who was detained for 20 hours was handcuffed even when going to the bathroom, while the other person detained with me who was not Black was not, I think may not have been a coincidence. I want to also mention that just 2 days before this executive order came into effect, the Secure Border Fence and Immigration Enforcement Improvement Order was signed, which authorizes the construction of many detention facilities across more, I would say, detention facilities along the US southern border. It requires the mandatory detention of people as their removal proceedings are pending, and it empowers state and local law enforcement to perform the functions of an immigration officer. So state and local law enforcement will essentially be empowered to determine someone's immigration status and consequently also what will happen to that person. Of course, we already saw an escalation of deportations under the Obama administration. And in fact, both of these orders draw on elements of 1996 and 2015 immigration laws and bills, but it's likely to get much worse under the Trump administration if you look at the language of these orders. I mention this because I think we have to talk about these two orders as interlinked, both in terms of the way they're shaping immigration policy and enforcement, but also in terms of the effects they're both having and are going to have on immigrant students, parents, and families. So I want to talk briefly about that. I think both of these orders are forcing so many to have to contend with uncertainty. For some, that means potentially having to return to war zones or to places where they're political dissidents and people may face imprisonment, torture, or even death. Just yesterday, 22 Somali refugees walked 12 kilometers in negative 22 Celsius degree weather from Emerson to cross the Canadian border in Manitoba to ask for asylum because they had pending asylum applications and feared getting deported under this order. One of the men, Farhan Ahmed, said he would face death if he returns. And some of these 22 may have school-age children. Then there's the uncertainty that people like myself face of not knowing when we're going to see our loved ones and family again because we cannot leave the US. Obviously, green card holders we're being told that we can, but I'm not going to risk it after what happened to me. And of course, my family cannot enter. For me, this was supposed to be the year my partner and I were going to bring my elderly parents to live with us here in the US. I'm not sure that that's going to be possible anymore. And there are thousands of students on F1 visas across the country who are likely in a similar position, who won't likely be able to see their families for a long time if this order isn't revoked. Others who've been planning to come to the US to pursue degrees, to rejoin family members, or even to join the faculty at particular universities who will no longer be able to do that. And the financial and emotional burden that places on them is heavy. Then there's the racism and Islamophobia these policies fuel, which have and will continue to make many students feel marginalized and unsafe. A family friend who works as a truck driver and lives in rural Illinois told me that he wants to move to California because his children are being called, names in school and feel unsafe. Students who are protected under DACA, whose parents or loved ones are undocumented, these policies also place, I think, a tremendous burden on them psychologically, financially, and emotionally. There are staff members and workers on our college campuses and schools who will also be affected by these orders. And it's often the people that care for us, that cook for us, that keep our classrooms clean, that are the most marginalized and burdened by these kinds of policies. And they may now have a much harder time caring for their own families and loved ones. Then, of course, there's the effects this will have on research and academic dialogue. I think that's something also that we have to consider, that there are scholars in the global south, and particularly from these 7 countries, that already have a hard time coming to the US to attend conferences and present their research. Then there are students like myself who are going to have to disrupt their research, who are doing research in these 7 countries, and we have to come up with plan Bs. So I guess the final points that I want to make is that I think there's an opportunity here for universities and schools to engage with their surrounding communities and to connect to local groups that have been organizing around these issues for many years now, by providing opportunities for support and by learning more about their work. Another Another point I want to make is that many of the media stories dominating the news focus on people who are PhD students like myself, on doctors and researchers who are making research and medical contributions, that this order is now, I think we have to resist that kind of exceptional citizen narrative. The janitors and construction workers on our campuses make equally valuable contributions to our communities. And the effects these orders will have on them are equally devastating and equally unjust. While they may feel less safe speaking out for various reasons, I think we have a responsibility to create more inclusive narratives when we speak to the media and to our students. And finally, I want to sort of make a call to green card holders and citizens who are watching, especially those of us affiliated and supported by our academic institutions. I think we need to speak out and engage in dialogue around these orders and their effects on people's lives in our classrooms, with our families, with our friends, because so many people who are affected may not be able to do so. Thank you.
Thank you, Nisreen. To extend our understanding of the legal context, we now have Jamie Lynn Crofts, Legal Director for the ACLU of West Virginia. Jamie specializes in constitutional and civil rights law and will update us on recent developments, the order's constitutionality, and its greater possible effects. Jamie?
Hi, I assume everyone can hear me. So I just wanted to give an update on exactly what's going on now and also what this means going forward. As you all know, the ban was entered on January 27th. And as of today, there have been more than 50 cases filed around the country challenging various parts of it. The most important case to watch right now was filed in Seattle and is Washington versus Trump. In that case, on Friday, February 3rd, the district court judge entered a nationwide temporary restraining order. And so what that did was prevent the federal government from enforcing the executive order. Last night, the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals heard an appeal of that order, and they have announced that they're not going to rule today. So what that means is that the current stay banning enforcement of the order is remaining in place at least through today. So what all of this means for you varies based on what your status in the United States is. If you're a citizen, even if you're a dual citizen of one of the 7 targeted countries, it shouldn't affect you. If you're a green card holder, it likely should not affect you. If you're a visa holder, then whether or not it affects you will depend on whether this temporary restraining order remains in place. The advice that I have for any visa holders who want to come back, who are currently outside of the country, is to come back as soon as possible with short layovers. Because we don't know how the Ninth Circuit is going to rule or what will happen after that, we can't guarantee that a temporary restraining order will remain in place going forward. The ACLU has been involved in many of the challenges of this law all over the country. Some of them are smaller cases that are affecting only the person who's actually involved. In other cases, they seek to represent states or larger classes of people who may be affected by the ban. For the time being, the temporary restraining order in Washington versus Trump remains the law. But like I said, it's very difficult to guess where things are going to go from here. Things have been changing very, very quickly in these cases, sometimes by the hour. And we've also heard reports of both airlines and border protection agents not uniformly enforcing the law across the board. So it's possible that even with the stay in effect, you may have some problems or be detained shortly when you're entering the country. Another thing that we are very concerned about are reports of visa holders being questioned about their political beliefs when they are entering the country. This is something, again, that is happening quickly, and we are not exactly sure if there is a current nationwide status. If something like this happens to you, I would recommend getting in touch with a civil rights or immigration attorney as soon as possible. I think that's about all I have for what this currently means, but I am happy to take any questions from the audience.
Thank you, Jamie. Now that we have a greater sense of the legal dimensions of this order, we will hear from Tasneem Siddiqui, visiting assistant professor in the Department of History, Politics, and Social Justice at Winston-Salem State University. Her research interests cover the intersections of race, power, and geography to explore how historically marginalized peoples and communities produce systems of knowledge, practice, and social movements. Towards that end, Tasneem will be discussing a number of key terms or frameworks for how to analyze and understand this moment now and historically. It is important to consider that 5 of the countries listed in the order were countries that were being bombed by the United States prior to the current president's inauguration. 2 of them faced extensive sanctions by former administrations. And February marks not only Black History Month, but the month of the Executive Order 9066 of 1942, which relocated more than 110,000 Japanese Americans to internment camps. Tasneem?
Sure, thank you. Can you all hear me? Is that? Okay, great. Thank you so much for inviting me to participate today. I just want to give you a brief map of what I'll be talking about. So I want to make a few comments first on history, and then give us sort of a quick and dirty laundry list of legislation and executive orders with immigration restriction. So this by no means exhaustive. However, I hope that it will prompt y'all to do further inquiry and study. And then lastly, I'll provide a few key concepts that will help us organize and contextualize our conversation. The first is just sort of to think about history, because again, this executive order is not an aberration, right? And it's important for us to think about history not in as sort of a straight line, but more circular. There's sort of this conversation how this happened in 2017. It's really like how we haven't really addressed these sort of fundamental premises of white supremacy, racial capitalism, and anti-Black racism that really permeate executive orders such as this. So I want to start just sort of by, again, not showing that this is not an aberration. If we look back historically, right, in 1798, we see immigration policies such as the Alien and Sedition Acts that really focused on one of the functions was allow the president to deport or imprison non-citizens who they deemed were hostile nations. We can go back to look at the Indian Removal Act of 1830, which a lot of folks don't see this as sort of an immigration policy, but it definitely is. And we see it resulted in displacement and dispossession of indigenous peoples from southeastern United States into Western territories that were becoming part of this larger U.S. National project. The last, I also want to look at the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, right, who specifically prescribed the entry of ethnic working group on the premise that it actually endangered the good order of certain localities. Next, I want to look at the Immigration Act of 1917. Right, so we see in this, post-wartime act, this shoring up or this confluence of political and immigrants that then first not only barred or excluded Indians, right, and inhabitants from the Asiatic zones, from Afghanistan to the Pacific, but also barred the immigration of Southern and Eastern Europeans, so primarily Jews and Italians. And a lot of this current actually happened because of, at this time in 1917, we also see the rise of labor movement, right, reaching sort of a peak. I want to go to the Johnson-Reed Immigration Act of 1924 as well, right? So what the Johnson Reed Act of 1924 actually was the most comprehensive immigration act that we see, right? So it puts sort of this numerical limit on immigration, but it also orders, it's this sort of global racial ordering and national hierarchy that favors some immigrants over others. It also establishes this relationship that the US has to the nation. And then, as Miriam has mentioned, the executive order of 9066, right, which was the order that effectively interned not only Americans, but also interned German Americans and Italian Americans as well into concentration camps. These sort of taking policies, but what they do is actually produce racial knowledge, not only about, like I said, the nation. It effectively looks to the nation, the relationship that the nation has with other global as well. Right, so this production of racial knowledge, these new categories of difference, right, sort of coupling racial and ethnic difference, either religious difference, geographic difference, this casting of particular individual persons as being permanent foreign or violent or unassimilable to citizenship. What that actually does and how that sort of organized is organizing under the system of not only racism, but racial capitalism. And I want to talk about that a little bit too. So it's actually impelling these immigration policies. If we have this understanding of what racial capitalism is, and I'll give you very sort of shorthand, and we can talk about this a little bit more in the question and answer, is it's really the organization of society by a racial hierarchy, right? So there's production of racialization of groups of people, but the production of racialization is a colonial process, right? It involves not only invasion, settlement, expropriation, and racial hierarchies that then permeate these social these social structures embedded within capitalism. And so seeing the sort of confluence of social organizing system, political organization, and economic organization through a particular type of economy. What I want to look at, just kind of coming forward in terms of thinking about this confluence, right? How anti-Black racism and Islamophobia are sort of coming together is to understand what is actually at the core of anti-Black racism. And these types of legislative policies, executive orders, actually do to further racialize Muslims. So as I talked about racialization, that process comes through invasion, genocide, settlement, expropriation. So at the core of anti-Black racism is rendering Blackness as synonymous with violence and criminality, right? So when we see, this is sort of the organizing logics of anti-Black racism, these organizing logics of anti-Black racism are now being applied not only to the Muslims, right, but they're being further applied to those that fall within the intersection as well. So, and Nasreen talked about, really thinking of the coupling of anti-Black racism and Islamophobia, particularly as we look at like 3 of these 7 countries are African countries. We start to see not only the increased vulnerability of African and Black Muslims, right? We also see this historical legacy. We take a longer historical approach, this historical legacy of this rendering the African Muslim, right, as being this sort of threat, erroneously seen as this threat to Western civilization. And I think that's something that we can talk about further in our question and answers. One last thing that I really wanted to just emphasize and get us to think about, that we need to pay close attention to, is this expansion of federal capacity and the expansion of executive order. So if we think of historically, what that's actually done is what happens aspects of these different policies and legislation is that you also see what follows that as different forms of incarceration, different modes of containment that's either followed or happens simultaneously. So if we can have maybe a discussion about that in the question and answers, that would be that I think that would also lead us to an understanding of how we actually then organize and mobilize across communities.
Thank you, Tasneem. For those of you in the audience, we are aware that there were some technical issues with that last presentation, so hopefully we can further get into the materials that she presented in the Q&A. But having gained some historical grounding, we now consider the work of ongoing movements and connections to these other movements with Carolina Ramirez, who serves as National Educator Organizer with the United We Dream Network, the largest immigrant youth-led organization in the country that organizes and advocates for the dignity and fair treatment of immigrant youth and families. She is based in Houston, Texas, and has DACA, Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals. Carolina?
Thanks so much, Miriam. Can you hear me okay? Great. Hi, everyone. I'm super excited to be here and to engage in this conversation. This moment is truly a frustrating moment for a lot of us who have been organizing for years in the community. We are finding that many in our community, including ourselves, have been facing a very frustrating and exceptionally difficult times. I do want to make it clear that as we talk about these executive orders, we keep in mind that this is also a moment to continue to push intersectionality within our organizing work. And what I mean by that is that 2 days before the Muslim ban, there was an executive order essentially targeting undocumented folks in this country. And I remember sitting around with some of our organizers in the network, and there was a conversation about the impact that it would have on undocumented communities. And it became really clear that we needed to talk about both executive orders together in order to effectively organize within our communities. And we wanted to make sure we emphasize that locally is really where the power is, and that we needed to coordinate nationally to do so in a savvier way. I don't think I'm sharing anything new, but I do want to help ground folks that these executive orders are impacting people of color, Muslim communities, LGBTQ, and we are all one. And as we're exploring organizing, we want to make sure that as we think about immigrant rights issues, we think about that also as a race issue. Folks are being impacted by these executive orders economically. We are also seeing that folks are increasingly more stressed out, and it's helpful that we have a lot more mental health resources available. So things that folks can explore is checking within your community, within your circle of friends, if there are such resources available. The executive order that I mentioned earlier that targets undocumented folks essentially makes it more likely that folks are going to be deported and deportable. And it's something that folks with this current executive order of the Muslim ban, now they're seeing that that is a reality as well. Due to the uncertainty and the quickly changing things, folks have found it difficult to understand what resources to trust and what information is right. So it is our role to make sure that we think about what are the local folks and resources that we can plug them into, and also what are some national organizations that can help share just overarching information. So I can share that some of the ones that we've been seeing and we've been sharing with folks that give a great breakdown of these is, for example, the National Immigration Law Center or the ILRC. And so for folks that are thinking about looking at the executive order and understanding fully what's going on and how is this impacting communities, maybe that's a good way to kind of get a sense. Folks across the community are worried about traveling and whether at some point they're going to be deportable. And so this can tend to either have folks seek out community or feel isolated. And so we want to make sure that in our spaces, we create community spaces to talk and also to connect within different folks that may have different experiences and immigrant backgrounds, and understand what the other one is going through, because you'd be surprised that the resources and the power you have is right there at home. We want to make sure that folks individually are checking in with loved ones, because this is very important in this time when a lot of us are running around and making sure that we're organizing our community. We want to make sure to take care of our personal circle of friends. And I think I'm talking to the organizers in the room who have been juggling a lot of stuff recently. I do want to mention that due to the uncertainty, it is imperative that folks continue to get together and organize in an intersectional way. And I can share that there have already been folks that have been doing this similarly. So to connect with us and kind of learn about how you can connect amongst movements, I would definitely recommend you text us to 877-877. You text the word "here to stay." UWD has a history of being an immigrant rights organization, but we are also acknowledging that we can do a better job in ensuring that we create an inclusive environment for fellow organizers that are Black, Muslim, LGBTQ, because we need to continue to think about how to improve within our organizing. I do want to share with some folks that protection networks are things that organizers have been doing on the ground. When I'm talking about protection networks, and as folks mentioned, the uncertainty and the quickly changing information, it's helpful to make sure that you have a connected network, that with one phone call, if in some moment you have a family member that either is deported, or if there's new information that just came out and you have a trusted source, that you can think of something like a phone texting group where you can share information collectively. But not only that, there's students that are thinking, what am I going to do with my studies? There are folks that are saying, I just fear that I have been a victim of racial violence, and so I want to know where to go. That there be a group of folks within your neighborhood or within your institution, within your community, that you can collectively talk and know that you can connect there. Because really that is a way of building power. I would invite you to connect with organizations locally. United We Dream, we have a couple of organizations across the country. And you can also check out weareheretostay.org and see some other organizations that are there. And think about it locally. What are other groups that you can connect with? Given your area of expertise, anyone, I think, can be an organizer. But you also want to make sure that within this, there are spaces for folks that are most directly affected to be able to share what is the need and where does the push have to happen. So I'll leave it there. I have more information, but happy to engage in this conversation.
Okay, thank you, Carolina, for some of the guidelines you give us and for the important work you guys are doing. Our next two speakers will speak to the specifics of how this order and other security actions are affecting students and how they are responding and how they can further respond. So Arshid Imtiaz Ali is Assistant Professor of Educational Research at the Graduate School of Education and Human Development at the George Washington University. His research examines the construction of racial identities through exploring notions of democracy, liberalism, and modernity in the lives of youth. Arshid? And unmute. Arshid, can you unmute?
That'll probably be helpful. Hi, can you hear me okay now?
Yes.
Wonderful. Okay, thank you, Miriam, and thank you everyone else on this call and all of our viewers and kind of participants in their local campus communities, as well as the various other communities that are tuning in. So I think I want to continue to kind of build on this conversation. I think we've heard a number of things about what's happening in a broader context, a broader political context as a result of this executive order. And I think one of the things that oftentimes university staff, faculty, and administrators begin with is this assumption that their universities, their campuses are somehow different from the societies that we live in. somehow the campus and our communities are not inherently intertwined and interlinked. We somehow believe our campuses are safe from the larger society, safe from the larger problems. But if we believe that our society, I mean, I think that's clearly not true. And if we believe our campus, our communities are clearly not post-racial, as people talked about over the past few years, and I think any of us can see that clearly, what makes us think our campuses are? Our schools exist within a racial capitalist state. They exist within a state that targets the poor, that targets people of color. And campuses aren't inherently safe for students. They're only safe when the campus actively works to make them safe. And this is one of the clear lessons from my over a decade of research with Muslim college students, as well as students of color from around the country, is that what happens in society, the verbal, the physical, the cultural, the social attacks, the targeting that happens to Muslim communities happens on the campus as well. They happen in classrooms by their peers. They happen in classrooms by faculty members and student affairs officers in one-on-one meetings. They happen by fellow students. And I think this is part of what I want to talk about. Another lesson my research has taught me is that any aspect of the Muslim personhood can be deemed potentially dangerous or seditious. So the question becomes, who and what is a safe Muslim? Policing agencies like the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the FBI, programs like the Countering Violent Extremism programs that often Muslim communities are engaging and supporting, these are programs that target Muslim youth or youth who are deemed to be Muslim, no matter where they come from, if they express any sort of anti-imperialist politics. Expressing any sort of critique of the state is often seen as a sign towards moving towards terrorism. This idea that if someone is critical of the state, they're going to attack civilians. And surely this isn't based in any reality. I mean, I think one of the things we know from actual data is that there's more of acts of violence against individuals for political purposes by white Americans in the US than any other group in this country. So this is not about anything based in reality and facts, but rather it's based upon fear-mongering. And I don't think in this moment that it's a coincidence that Muslim life is being attacked. In the same political moment, there's a very strong anti-Latino and anti-immigrant populist movement in the Southwest. It's not a coincidence this is happening in the same moment that Black activists are being targeted for simply saying that police don't have the right to indiscriminately kill Black people in the streets. And this executive order is another manifestation of this. As we have heard, anti-Muslim violence and rhetoric cannot somehow be discussed in isolation of anti-Blackness and anti-immigrant policies rampant in the US. And I think this is how we have to understand Muslim life as being kind of intersectional at its core. The cultural targeting directed towards Muslims is not a post-9/11 phenomenon. And I can't discuss this in detail here, but we have to remember that kind of the foundations of Muslim otherness in the Americas is not new, but the idea of the project of America in and of itself, of the United States, comes about, and kind of the colonization of the United States happens through the wealth generated from evicting Muslim and Jewish life from Spain and using that wealth to fund Columbus's travel to the New World. So literally the wealth generated through attacking Jewish and Muslim life is the wealth that begins the foundations of the colonization of this country. We have to remember that. So when people kind of make this argument that we have always been here, this is true. People of color, immigrants, enslaved Africans, native indigenous peoples, Muslims have always been here. But we have always been here since the inception of this country as enslaved communities, as targeted communities, as hated communities. And this idea of the violent, rebellious, suspicious Muslim figure continues to haunt this country. So, and I talk about this history not just to talk about history, but rather that we can't understand where we are unless we understand where we came from. So kind of moving on to what's happening in schools. When we see the daily attacks happen of kind of women, whether it's women's headscarves being pulled off, the burning of mosques, people being beaten in the streets or suspended or fired from work, we have to ask what is happening, what's allowing this to happen. Students around the country, even prior to this order, have been targeted. One of the things we have to remember is that, or one of the things we see is that students are afraid. Students are afraid to speak out publicly, and their institutions need to kind of make active efforts to support them. So I think what I'd like to kind of, the last kind of point I want to touch on is what are universities what are they to do? What are some of the things they can be doing in this moment? And I'll list a couple of things. First is being honest with their student communities about what's happening with policing agencies. What information is the university turning over to policing agency? And they have to be clear about this and honest with their students. Universities also have to have clear and clearly articulated hate speech policies that protect vulnerable communities. One of the things we see in this moment is free speech policies are being used as a right to bully people without power. And that's not what free speech policies are about and hate speech policies. They're not used to bully the people who have the least power in our society. They're used to protect those who have the least power. Thirdly, kind of this idea of kind of public statements of support. Those are wonderful, and universities should be encouraged to do that. But statements without commitments are hollow. Universities need to engage in real commitments to support student life, whether that means mental health services, academic services, campus activities, whether it's resources for student groups, whether it's legal support or time off degree, particularly for students who are suffering in the context of this executive order. And I'll talk about more of this later if we want to talk about more specific things campuses can do, because I want to kind of make sure we have enough time to continue our conversation. So thank you.
Okay, thank you, Arshid. I just wanted to remind all our viewers out there that you should text your comments and questions in on the chat accompanying the YouTube window, and also keep tweeting the Teach-In EO 2017. So now we have our final speaker, Shireen Vosugi, who is Assistant Professor of Learning Sciences at Northwestern University. Her research focuses on the cultural and political dimensions of learning and the design of learning environments for youth from migrant, immigrant, and diasporic backgrounds. So Shireen.
Thanks, Mariam. Can you all hear me? Okay. Thanks, everybody. I'm going to try to build on some of Arshid's comments and make some specific suggestions and points for professors and teachers in particular in university and K-12 and early childhood education. And I think there's some strands in what other people shared that that definitely connect to the ways that we think about pedagogy and education. So just building on what Arshid was talking about, I think it's important that professors and teachers acknowledge first and foremost what's happening and recognize that our classrooms are not enclosed off from the world, or they're not politically neutral spaces. One of the things that we've heard consistently from students who are affected by these types of political events is the sense of isolation and alienation that can happen when classes go on as if it's business as usual. So I think it's essential for us to recognize these occurrences and to understand the impact that they're having on students and their families and communities. At the same time, I think how we open and hold space for discussing these events in our classrooms really matters. And so I think it's essential to have a plan and to anticipate some of the vulnerabilities and the kinds of tensions that can emerge when space is open to discuss these kinds of events in classrooms. So for example, depending on the context, simply opening the space to have a free discussion about something like the executive order can actually create a space for racist and xenophobic ideas to be aired in ways that reproduce harm for students that are affected. Also, students from Muslim and Southwest Asian and North African backgrounds, as well as students of color more broadly, have consistently expressed concern about being spotlighted in their classrooms or expected to speak on behalf of their communities. And we know that that's not only an unfair responsibility, but it's also a form of tokenizing. So those are some of the things to be cautious about in thinking about opening space. And some strategies, we don't have time to get into the nuances, but some of the strategies that we found to be productive is, first of all, for teachers and professors to do the work of thinking about how these issues relate to their course content in substantive ways, and then offering students access to critical analysis of these issues from multiple perspectives. We've also found it important to kind of set ground rules for discussion. Some people talk about this as community ways of being, and many people open their classrooms with this at the beginning of the year, at the beginning of the quarter, so it can be a good opportunity to revisit those ground rules and recommit to those in preparing for having these discussions. And one of the things that I think it's important to mention to students is that for some, thinking about something like the executive order and the political issues that it raises may be an intellectual exercise, whereas for other students, it's something that is personally affecting them in a very real way. And so what kinds of listening might be important to practice in those spaces. One other strategy I wanted to mention is I think it can be really powerful for professors and teachers to work together to develop plans for these types of discussions, to help each other anticipate the kinds of comments that might emerge in classes and the various kind of generative ways to respond to those comments. And I think this ties to a bigger issue, which is that we often think of professional development in this arena as an issue of best practices or teaching strategies, and those are absolutely important. However, I think we need to also develop spaces for critical analysis and historical understandings among educators. And I think that kind of deeper understanding of issues of racism and patriarchy and other forms of power is necessary for being able to read the complexity of classroom interactions that allow us, in ways that allow us to really respond with nuance and care. And just to give a shout out to UPenn Center of Race and Equity in Education, they have a lot of resources and modules that I encourage people to look into that might be helpful for developing some of those strategies. The second point I want to make is about the ways that these issues are connected, particularly for K through 12 contexts. And I think the first is to recognize the stress and fear that many young people and children are experiencing. A couple of the other speakers touched on this as well, and I think that includes for kids and for youth, the fear of being physically or verbally attacked, the fear of being separated from one's family members, and also the fear of being deported or having one's family members deported. So these are some of the very real fears that young people are experiencing. And we know from the recent numbers about hate crimes and about bullying that their fears are really not unfounded. So at a basic level, I think students need to know that their teachers, their counselors, their after-school educators are aware of what's happening and that they're going to do the work of making sure that our educational spaces do serve as sanctuaries rather than conduits for state violence. And I think that one immediate way we can do that is, do the students in your university or school know who to talk to or who is trusted at that institution if they're experiencing some of these things, or if they encounter or experience an instance of racial violence or harassment? What are the protocols? How do people gain support in those moments, and is that clear? So those are some immediate steps I think we can take. Another point here is I think we need to combat the assumption that children, and particularly young children, are not aware of what's happening around them. And I think we should move from the assumption that they're actively making sense of these narratives and the forms of racism that everybody on the panel is talking about. And I think that goes for young people from dominant as well as non-dominant backgrounds. So some of the strategies that we're learning from elementary school teachers and early childhood educators to address some of these issues includes the use of children's books as a tool for meaning making and dialogue, and also the use of theater to provide opportunities for kids to practice how they might respond if they witness an instance of bullying or harassment, or if they're experiencing one. And I think a key point here is the importance of being proactive. So not waiting until something has happened to pull out the books and pull out the role play theater activities, but really taking the steps to anticipate and acknowledge the way that kids are already dealing with these things. So we're currently developing a handbook that draws from the tradition of theater of the oppressed that will be available soon for educators. There's also a Bay Area conference on sanctuary education that's coming up that's focused specifically on the needs of Arab and Muslim youth in schools. And there's organizations like the People's Education Movement, which I think provides a lot of resources and opportunities to connect with teachers who are already engaging in this type of work. So those are just some resources to draw upon. And I wanted to close by just making a couple points about resistance and resistance among young people in particular. So I know there's a lot of high school classrooms and maybe some middle school classrooms that are calling into the teach-in today. And I just wanted to say that I think we can learn from the ways you all as young people are already resisting these policies and the underlying ideologies that they are rooted in. And I think it's important to say that that includes visible forms of leadership and participation in protests and organizing, as well as everyday forms of resistance through things like dissent, acts of self-love and solidarity. And so we hear a lot about bullying and we hear a lot about harassment in schools, and those are absolutely important to talk about, but we don't hear as much the stories about the way children and youth are standing up for each other and taking care of each other in this time. And I think those are important to highlight as well. And that includes the way high school youth and university students are organizing their own spaces to foster community building and opportunities to learn about their own histories. And I think young people are especially good at using things like music and art and media and humor to nurture community well-being and to respond in these moments. And I think as adults, we can learn from your strategies. And I also think it's our responsibility to support the cultural and political spaces that young people are creating. So the last point I wanted to make is about, I tend to think of protest and organizing as both political activity and pedagogical activity. And I think in that spirit, there's an important moment right now to be self-critical about the narratives that drive organizing. And I think this connects with some points that Nisreen made and Carolina made about intersectionality. So slogans like "We are a nation of immigrants" is a slogan that I've often seen in the last few weeks. And I think those are opportunities to have conversations about settler colonial and anti-Black erasure and the need for a more expansive view of coalitional politics at this time. And I also have seen a lot of memes and posts about, the ways the executive order mistakenly targets doctors or scientists or successful business folks. And I think those are opportunities to have conversations about class hierarchy within our communities and about how to develop a politics that's rooted in human dignity rather than respectability. And sometimes when I raise those concerns, I get pushback from people that say now is not the time to get into those nuances or critiques. But I think as educators, we know well that action and critique are not mutually exclusive. And I think one of the ways to counter the politics of distraction, which some people have talked about, where our energies get mobilized towards fighting these kinds of executive orders, is to treat movement building and classroom discussions as not just forms of resistance, but also as occasions for, imagining and enacting the kind of world that we're trying to bring into being. So I'll stop there.
Okay, thank you so much, Shireen. So we are now at the end of the presentation portion of the teach-in. We have about 30 minutes to do question and answer, so please keep sending in your questions and comments. We're going to start with a question for Khalid Beydoun. And this question is in regards to a number of things that our speakers have mentioned in terms of the surveillance that was already happening on Muslim communities. And there's an interest in understanding how this surveillance, which is impacting citizens and non-citizens, and how is it related to this current Muslim ban or executive order. Khalid, unmute, please.
There we go. Yeah, so it's important to kind of think about how this executive order fits with, kind of this broader strategy of, state-sanctioned Islamophobia. The order is the first step of what we might think is going to be a series of policing programs that target Muslim Americans specifically. Trump is looking to extend a specific surveillance program that was installed by President Obama in 2011 called Countering Violent Extremism. He's likely going to rename it Countering Islamic Violence. And the way this works is you have specifically Department of Homeland Security working closely with local law enforcement, so police departments in places like LA, Detroit, Boston, Minneapolis. It's already actually been implemented in 3 cities, hardline counter-radicalization programs in LA, Boston, in Minneapolis. And the way this fits with the Muslim ban, broadly speaking, is it kind of works with the same baseline that anything linked to Muslim identity is presumptive of terrorism. More specifically, the way it works on the ground in these communities is you could have law enforcement and their informants, right? They're proxies on the ground, informants within the Muslim American community, whether they be imams, they could be students, they could be heads of MSA, they can be high school students and lesser than even high school students. We see programming focusing on junior high school students. In my own community, one program was actually thwarted. So we thwarted a CVE program here in the Detroit area last week. But the reason and the way it works in conjunction with this Muslim ban is that if, let's say you have an informant in a school, for instance, right? So you shape and you mobilize a high school kid in Fortson High School in Dearborn, for instance, right? To kind of look out for a student who might be inclined towards radical, quote, activity. So let's say, a kid goes from being, secular, and then next week decides to start going to the mosque. His family might have traveled to Yemen or Iraq over the holiday and so forth. And let's say his parents are Iraqi nationals and visa holders or undocumented, right? That surveillance could actually mobilize young students and informants in the community to, essentially do the, immigration work, if you will, and kind of the identifying and deportation work that this Muslim ban is looking to do. So that's an example, but I think it's really critical, and some of the speakers earlier mentioned that it's really important to think about all of these xenophobic, Islamophobic, and racist policies as being intertwined. And not only intertwined, but they work in concert with one another to advance their distinct goals. And surveillance, which I think is going to be the next kind of broad executive order, this Countering Islamic Violence program, is the Trump administration will focus in on with regard to Muslims and Muslim Americans.
Okay, thank you, Khalid. And so this is a question for a number of you, and we may start with Nisreen. What are some of the things that universities and university staff and teachers can do to support students or others affected by this order? Nisreen, can you unmute? Or maybe we can start with Arshid while Nisreen is unmuting.
Sure. I'm happy to share some ideas, and I think Shireen also has some ideas. That, because I know her and I have been talking about this for some time. So I think a couple of things. I shared a few of them earlier. Things about being honest with policing agencies, hate speech policies, real commitments. Other things universities need to be doing is supporting those who oppose anti-Muslim racism or discrimination, and broadly people who are working for anti-racism. One of the things we see is internet trolls as well as hate mongers target our faculty, our staff who are working on anti-racist projects, and universities need to stand strongly behind them. And that's I think an important role and responsibility of university administrators. That's kind of a beginning space. I think other things universities really need to be thinking about doing, particularly kind of university staff, is creating opportunities for students, creating opportunities to support students. And if we move outside of a formal administrative role of what kind of a university as an institution can do, what counselors can and should be doing is checking in with students. And I think one of the things that's difficult about this moment of surveillance is sometimes students don't want to get together in groups, because what that does is encourage another form of gaze, another moment of people looking at them in particular ways. So sometimes for administrators and staff individually to just check in with students and ask students what they need. I think one of the things that often happens, particularly from students from broadly Muslim backgrounds on college campuses, is that the response is to have spaces of prayer available, spaces to watch for prayer, or halal meat options, which are all great and wonderful, but we have to remember there's a vast diversity in Muslim communities. And the issues we're talking about are issues of structural violence, issues of targeting. They're not simply issues of engaging in religious practices. So we need to talk to the diversity of our students, and that means that we move outside of simply just talking to student group leadership, but we find the students who are not connected, and we build relationships with them. And I'll kind of pause there and kind of Shaheen.
Sure. So I wanted to just add a few suggestions that are related to the executive order in particular, in terms of what universities can do. So I think one very clear step that universities can take is to provide access to legal services for students. We know that Harvard Law School's Immigration and Refugee Clinic has recently established a full-time staff attorney to support students. And I think this is like a very, immediate step that universities can take. Is to offer legal services. I also think there's some questions raised by the executive order, and we're not sure what's going to happen in the courts with regard to students completing their degrees. And so holding space open for existing students who are potentially not able to return to the US or supporting them to finish their degrees abroad is another immediate step. And I also think there's questions raised about students who are currently in the application pipeline, who may be applying to study in the US from the 7 countries that are named in the executive order. And I think universities can be creative about ways to support students, whether it's deferred admission or other steps to take so that we're not participating in that level of discrimination that in response to students' admissions.
Okay, Nisreen, are you there?
Yes, sorry about that. Yeah, I think, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, I guess I just want to reiterate some of the things that other speakers have said. I think we need to create opportunities on campuses for people affected by these orders to share the kinds of support they need in a way that feels safe to them, and then respond accordingly. I think also I agree that I think we can't place the burden on those most affected to be sort of publicly speaking about this for various reasons. Both in terms of their own safety, so that's another thing. I think we need to support students, workers, and their families through protests and gestures of solidarity, but also by providing counseling, legal support, creating emergency funds in cases where financial help is needed. And again, I want to emphasize we have to consider that there are workers on campus that are just as affected as we are as students and faculty, and to include them in that dialogue. Similarly, I think there's an opportunity to connect with scholars in those 7 countries who are affected by this, right? So either people who are on their way, or people who were likely to come to conferences in the United States, et cetera, and to, again, open up a dialogue to see how we can stand in solidarity with them, and to see how we can be best, provide institutional support, use the university resources to do that, to support them. I think, again, I can't emphasize enough the kind of psychological burden that this uncertainty places on people. And the way that affects their personal relationships, to their friends, to their family members, to the people around them. When these kinds of things happen, students often feel more marginalized and sort of more isolated than in any other moment. And so I think it's important to also respond to that aspect of things. Thank you.
Okay, great, thank you. I have a question here for Jamie about traveling. There's a sort of 2 questions here. Traveling within the country, if you are from a country that is affected by the executive order, is that safe? And then also, can students and faculty go to conferences and such things, or should they refrain from traveling? And I think this question was in reference to those who have F1 visas or green cards or refugees.
Absolutely. Can you hear me? Okay. So as far as traveling within the United States, no one should have any problems. Once you are in the US, you have a right to travel within the US. As far as traveling outside of the country for conferences and the like, that I would say whether or not I would recommend going depends on what your current status is. If you are a citizen, you should not have any problems attending conferences or just traveling outside of the country. If you are a green card holder, likewise, right now you should not have problems leaving or entering the country. And Green card holders initially, and by the language of the executive order, are covered by it. But as of right now, even absent the court orders, the Department of Homeland Security has said they are not going to enforce the executive order against green card holders. So green card holders should also be safe to travel outside of the country, but I would definitely recommend speaking with an immigration attorney before you leave, just to see what they think. I specialize in, constitutional law and not specifically immigration law. So definitely speak to someone who practices immigration law if you're a green card holder. If you are a visa holder, right now, I would recommend not leaving the country. Like I said earlier, we really don't know how quickly these cases are going to unfold and what the next ruling might be. If you need to leave the country or you have family that is trying to return that's currently outside of the country, definitely get in touch with an immigration attorney, and also a civil rights organization like the ACLU or others that are on the ground at the airports, so they can advise you on what the current status is and also on what you might face when you land.
And there was a sort of follow-up question in terms of legal issues. Do you have any sense of how long it will take courts to rule on the constitutionality of this order?
It's really hard to predict, unfortunately. This is something that could, within a matter of weeks or months, be decided by the United States Supreme Court. We are expecting a preliminary ruling from the appellate court in the next couple of days, but that is not a final ruling. That's just on whether the order can be enforced while the court cases proceed. My guess is that a final ruling would probably take at least a few months, but we are hopeful that the executive order will never be enforced while the litigation is ongoing.
Okay, thank you. And so this question, any of you can answer. What pedagogical strategies can we employ to address presumptions of individuals who support the executive order? Shadeen, do you want to take that, or Tasneem?
You can jump in.
Sure. So I think part of the reason that we organize the teach-in in this way is to emphasize the importance of historicizing these issues. So I think one really important pedagogical strategy is to historicize the executive order and to look at other instances where particular communities of color have been targeted, which some of the speakers talked about today. And I think historical analysis is one way to support young people who may be supporting the executive order for various reasons, to understand the connections to white supremacy and the connections to racialization that folks have talked about. I also think that there's some key ideas in our common sense discourse around safety, around terror, around security that are really helpful to unpack. And so supporting young people to take those key terms and to try to define them and to try to think about how they're defined in the media and to actually do some critical discourse analysis of the way the media may be in different ways framing some of those issues can also be helpful, because I think that once we start to take them apart, the internal contradictions around safety and who's treated as the subjects that are worthy of protection and who's treated as dangerous subjects start to become really visible. And I think those are some of the strategies that initially come to mind. The other thing I wanted to mention is that we often talk about pedagogical strategies as tied to discussion. And I've found that some of the most productive ways to help young people understand the implications of supporting something like the executive order happen through writing and happen through one-on-one conversations. So I think it can be helpful to develop writing assignments that support people to look at things from different perspectives and to make visible the ways that they're making meaning about these policies in a way that creates an occasion for feedback that may be more productive in certain ways than some of the whole group discussions that tend to be how we frame pedagogy around these issues.
Did anyone want to add anything else in answering this question? Okay, thank you. And then the next question we have is a question about sanctuary. And this was directed towards Tasneem. Could you elaborate what the term sanctuary means for cities and institutions? And can you unmute your microphone?
Sure, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. It's important for us to think about what the historical genealogy of sanctuary cities was, and that was around the 1980s, supporting particularly communities from Central America. So, but I think that's going to look different depending on the city and depending on the institution. So what I would like to sort of frame is about sanctuary cities as a place of refuge, as a place of safety, right? So in my own research and my own work and just the study of historically marginalized communities, African and African descendant communities, what that really means is for us, how do we actually proactively engage our communities and sort of shift our interrelationships, our interpersonal relationships with one another. Historically, when we looked at aggrieved communities, historically marginalized communities, the ways that we've actually been able to survive these systems of racial capitalism, right? To survive imperialism and colonialism and the genocidal logics, supremacy is very strong community. So what that's going to do is that's going to look very differently depending on where you are, depending on your locality, and depending on the relationships that you've established with your neighbors, with your coworkers, with friends, with individuals. So I think what I would say just from an organizer's perspective and just from a human perspective is sort of like what are the ways in which you can support those that are being adversely affected by these different immigration policies, but essentially just sort of you know, because and I'm not sure if this was, I know that my sort of video cut out, but and so I will reiterate, it's really important for us to pay close attention to these expansion of executive and federal capacities because these windfall racialized legislation, what happens is it's either followed by or happens simultaneously different modes of incarceration and containment. Right? So we have to think about what that actually is going to look like and how that's going to impact our various communities. So on the one hand, I also want to emphasize while we are, you know, sort of just focusing and, you know, and I know that this is one of the reasons why y'all had this teach-in is to actually to help us understand how do we approach this systematically. Right. So on the one hand, we see this immigration ban and as various folks had talked about what is that actually going to like, number one, for us collectively, but also what is that taking our attention away from? What types of, you know, we constantly are seeing it, you know, sort of in you know, these neoliberals of the increased privatization of particular services and resources, right? So what is necessarily going to happen to, you know, the increased privatization of or the dismantling of public education? The fight for clean drinking water, right? So places like Flint, places like Standing Rock as well. What is going to be absent in people's everyday existence and really who are going to be grossly affected by that as well. So it's mostly working for undocumented communities, those sort of most vulnerable to these different types of legislations and policies. So I think I say all that to say is that what sanctuary looks like for each of us collectively and individually for our cities and institutions is going to be different depending on the type of social forces that you're facing too. I hope that answers or gives some sort of context to that question.
Yes, thank you. And we probably only have time for one more question. Can students feel free to speak out without our universities being targeted by Trump? And anyone can answer this.
I'm happy to jump in if
Go for it.
I think there's a couple of answers I want to share, or comments I want to share. I think the first is and I think for me the true answer is we don't know. We don't know what broadly the Trump administration is going to do to target free speech of students and broadly speech on the left. I think that's kind of the real material answer, but I think I'd like to kind of frame this in kind of in a different way. And I think it's something I've been thinking about for the past few months, really. And I think it's nothing new to many of us, but I think it's returning to the question of, for many of us, how many of us have claimed to be broadly proponents and supporters of civil rights movements in this country, liberation movements in this country, whether it was Black Power movement, Chicano Power movements, movements of the 60s and 70s. And we aren't talking, and for us in this moment, we're not talking about liberation movements. I'd love for us to arrive there. But right now, we're simply talking about basic civil rights, the rights of human beings to exist. And I think what we're realizing is when someone is fundamentally attacking that, it's hard and it's scary to say no. And it's not easy to say no, but I'm gonna say this is the moment that tests our mettle, tests the kind of people we are and the claims we've made to history. And in some ways, I'd say today is the day history has arrived. And we have to answer who we're going, if we are the people we claim to be. And so that doesn't mean, I think, as Shireen taught us and is teaching us, that it's not the same thing for everybody, but it's something for everyone. So I think everyone has to do something, but it can happen in very different ways.
Did anyone want to add anything to that?
So can I add something to that?
Yes.
If that's possible.
Sure. And then Carolina, I see you want to say something.
Right. So I wanted to add, this is really important for us to think about too, because, you know, in my classes and with my students, I also talk to them about what does radical mean, right? So we sort of have to untether that from this dominant sort of narrative that it's extremism. And I go back to looking at these, you know, Black liberation movements, Black freedom struggles, which are instructive for us to think about how we should organize, how we need to move in this moment right now. I absolutely agree with Arshad in the sense that, like, you know what, this is really, this is our moment right now, right? So it's like, this is what we have not experienced, this type of moment, you know, for our generation necessarily. So it really is asking us to show up. How are we going to show up if we're very serious about thinking about what does it mean to have a human-centered society, right? And not a wealth-centered society, but a human-centered society. Because it's initially, I mean, I'm sorry, not initially, but it's really about what does it mean for us to be humans, to be fully human? What does our humanity mean, right? So we're living in a time of mass dehumanization of all life, right? And how do we then initiate life-affirming systems? I think that sort of needs to sort of foreground our politics, foreground the ways that we organize too, and to think about, you know, just for students that are looking at other liberation movements, decolonizing movements, and sort of reclaim what radical means. And I go back to Ella Baker, and that means really getting down to the root, understanding the root cause, understanding these different sort of systems of oppression, understanding what colonialism means, understanding what imperialism means, and how that actually affects our sort of day-to-day existence, our quotidian realities.
Okay, thank you. Carolina?
Yeah, so I wanted to share, when I started organizing in a small campus in rural Texas, Deep South. Not a very popular place to say that you were proud to be an immigrant, a brown woman of immigrant parents that had been undocumented, and that we had folks from all over the world who stood by us and said, we need an inclusive campus. And it wasn't very popular. It was definitely uncomfortable for many of us that we're kind of throwing ourselves into organizing inclusive spaces. A lot of us were very afraid about what were going to be the repercussions, especially in a tiny campus. We were 2 hours away from a larger city, where we saw that potential allies could have our back. We were scared, but we grounded ourselves that as students, we brought the stories of our families with us. And that is powerful because universities are supposed to be a space where you can challenge ideas and challenge ignorance. And if in those spaces we cannot talk freely about what we say, what we stand in our experience, then I question, where can we feel safe? And so what I would say is there are already students that are coming out and speaking out in different ways. You don't have to stand outside and do a die-in as we did outside our campus, reclaiming our right to be immigrant and unafraid. You can do it in small conversations, one-on-one, and then build up on that. But what I would say is ground yourself in what you have to offer to the conversation. And also, I found that coming out and being visible could also mean putting visuals around campus and inviting folks to understand what we were going through and the struggle that we were going through. And helping people engage online sometimes helped us identify allies, and then we gained the courage to come out even more. So I share that as a personal experience, and I hope it helps a couple of fellow students out there.
Could I also just add real quickly? Sorry.
Yes.
I also feel like this is an opportunity for us to actually engage with our own communities that are affected by this. So for me as a Muslim, I've been having a lot of conversations with other Muslims about anti-Blackness and about the criminalization of Black people, and sort of historicizing that, right, for us in terms of just also, I think, making those connections for ourselves, you know, even in conversation with people who are documented, and sort of engaging with them around what it means to stand in solidarity with people who are undocumented at this time. So I think that's also something that maybe I feel like has been missing, that even within our communities, there's a lot of sort of building that we have to do on our own, and also reframing the discussion to talk about, you know, everybody's talking about like safety and security of the nation, and we need to start talking about, well, who has the right to feel safe and who doesn't, and who has had the right to feel safe and who has not, right, for a very long time. So I just wanted to add that as well.
Okay. Thank you. And I would just add, from our university experience, we've been organizing a lot of film screenings. We showed all 14 hours of Eyes on the Prize here and found it a really illuminating way to think through the current moment, through a really important time in our history. And so at this point, I'm going to close our teach-in, but I encourage you all to continue the conversations in your classrooms, in your communities, in your homes. I want to thank the Center for the Study of Race and Equity in Education at UPenn, especially Charles Davis. Thank you to the graduate students, Ashley Eisen, Natalia Smirnov, and Crystal Villanosa, who assisted us technically. The center will be uploading a video of the teach-in that you could forward on to your networks. It will most likely be available definitely by tomorrow. And so we'll be sending out links to this video to people who registered for the program. And please keep an eye out for future projects of the Courage Collective and for additional projects from the Center on Race and Equity. And I really thank you for participating today with us.